Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here with Jason Blaha Strength and Fitness, and today I thought I would chat with you guys and gals about something that's going to be a controversial topic, but every really good coach I know who's been doing this more than 20 years will laugh and agree. They're going to agree. Exercise selection is so massively overrated for muscle growth, and it really is. And if you look at both the evidence and look at the real world, we know this is the case. And if you don't believe me, then ask yourself why so many pro bodybuilders do completely different exercises and still get insanely jacked. Okay? Let that sink in for a moment. Is it because they found the type of curl that works for them? No, it's because they're doing a curl. They're training the bicep. Okay? Right? Do we all understand this? And I think what's funny, you remember when we had guys like Martin Birkin? I feel like that should be addressed. I should make some videos just addressing Birkin again. I only had people doing 4 or 5 exercises, and he was crazy jack, great aesthetics, great physique, just because he got really shredded and lean and had the dietary adherence. Of course, there's a genetic component. But plenty of people did that. People were like, why? And he's just making everyone do the same movements. It doesn't make sense. Sure it does. They were training really hard with exercises that hit everything. And I think people need to understand anything beyond that, you're chasing a tiny bit of extra gains. And in other words, stuff like that will literally get 90% of your muscle growth. And most people, honestly, really are not going to want to put in always the efforts to get the other 10%. It may not be worth it. But generally speaking, yeah, you can gain 90% of the muscle in your body if you just train hard enough with like 5 exercises. 5 or 6 exercises, totally possible, as long as they're big movements that hit everything. And I think the reason I say this with the exercise selection, because ultimately, when you're looking at different exercises, people are looking at, well, maybe it works this part of the muscle more than this part, or doesn't hit over here. So they're looking at things that don't matter. In other words, you're looking at muscles in the context of early reps. Okay, does everyone understand? Particularly if you're doing enough big movements. This is why I tell people big exercises will cover everything. And then you can fill in the gaps. Look, if you need some other tricep work, then do some tricep work. So again, let me be clear. When I make this statement, I'm not telling people, look, if your calves are lagging, not to train calves. I'm not telling you not to train your triceps if your triceps still suck when you're benching 315. Okay, this is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that's probably just a genetic difference, structural difference. Because here's the thing, when people are looking at these individual nuances, assuming they're oftentimes only looking at isolation, or even when they're looking at a big exercise, they're looking at low volumes, individual sets, non-failure sets. Okay? Because when you look at all the compiling data, what happens? As training volume goes up, the whole dang muscle grows. As intensity, proximity to failure, or weight on the bar goes up on a big movement, all the heads of the muscles get involved. So we need to understand this. Well, if we look at even the studies on the bench press, and we do know guys out there who don't even do tricep work, who have massive triceps, who bench 405 for reps. We all know these guys. They're out there. They're like, dang, they got big old triceps, and you find out they don't even do much for them. But they bench a lot. Okay? These freaks are out there. But you need to look no further than a lot of the data we have on the bench press. Like, what do we see? Well, that when volumes are low, the entire chest grows, but then the triceps get some growth, but they're sometimes understimulated. The lateral head grows at 100%. Long head lags a little bit, right? We see this. But what happens when we take volumes up? When we take volumes higher and higher, keeping in mind, all those heads grow. Okay? All those heads grow. So when we're looking at studies, looking at it, it's not like the whole tricep doesn't grow from the bench press. It's that the lateral head of the long head of the tricep grew the least out of all the primary movers when volumes are low. But what happens as volume goes up on a movement and intensity goes up? Well, as volume goes up, keep in mind, every subsequent set we do of quality work gets less and less growth. up because we start approaching the maximal limits of how much a muscle can tolerate and recover from. But as those volumes go up, those lagging heads get more and more and more stimulus and get closer also. They're still maybe not getting 100%, but it goes up. But what about you look at all the EMG on things like the bench? Things like the pec versus tricep, when people are weak, there's the closed grip bench works the tricep more, the wider grip works the pec more. But when it's tested in power lifters who have a high neural drive, they all activate 100%. Same thing when rep work's been looked at on a bench press. So you notice these are technically different exercises in this case. And I'm about to tell you this would apply to a dip, it would apply to an incline bench, it would apply to all these other movements. As intensity goes up on the bench, what happens? The pecs on lower intensities seem to get more of the work, but as the intensity and proximity to failure, which I mean again, also how close we got to the 1 rep max goes up, the long head gets fully activated. So when you start hitting a 90% of your max on a bench and they hook the electrodes up, they find the long head of the bench hits 100% activation. That's the head that grows the least when these low volumes of rep work are done. Okay, that same effect is going to happen when you get close to failure. All right? So if you have a few different exercises, you see where I'm about to go? Nobody's doing only one exercise. Most people are doing at least 2 exercises that hit every muscle. You're getting a ton of variation. All these differences in exercises oftentimes are only significant in terms of injury prevention and inflammation, and if very small amounts of training are done. Sure. If you're only doing 6 or 7 reps with your 10 rep max and you stop at 2 sets, yeah, exercise selection is going to matter. But what happens when you start doing 3 sets twice a week on an exercise and they're real close to failure? All the muscles are getting every single muscle involved in that exercise is getting stimulus. What happens when you start overlapping stuff? What happens if you're doing squats and deadlifts? What happens if you're doing a pull-up and a row? What happens if you're doing 2 different types of chest presses? You're doing bench and dips, or incline and dips, or so on and so forth. See where we're about to go with this? Same thing even when different types of curls are looked at. Well, when we do this here, we're seeing slight differences in the amount of muscle that grows here or there. But then they start studying rows to it and they find that rows complete it. It's like, what? There's at least a recent study that found that the upper part of the bicep grew from a dumbbell row, not even an underhand grip, when compared to a dumbbell curl. The upper half of the bicep grew more and the lower half grew more from the dumbbell curl. So as these movements start overlapping, all these other heads get hit. As training volumes and intensity and neural drive go up, all the muscles are starting to get activated more and more and more. Okay? Now, am I saying that poor exercise selection is going to give you 100% of muscle growth? No. But again, when we're looking for more, if you start looking in the context of some of the data and what we see, a handful of exercises can build the overwhelming majority of the muscle in your body. Again, if we're pushing hard enough. And because there's so much overlap, especially if your training is built around fairly big movements, everything is going to get worked. Are you possibly going to have a muscle or two that is lagging behind? Yes, but it's pretty easy to fill in the gaps on those. And you may not care. A lot of times the guy is like, well, as long as I'm getting bigger, do I really care that maybe my brachialis in my arm or the lower part of my bicep is only getting 90% of its possible growth instead of 100, but it's still getting bigger. But you see the point? If you have anything that's lagging from your training, it's not hard to fill in the gaps, and you're probably the only one who notices. Probably anyone who's a serious physique person is the only one who notices. Nobody else out there even sees it. So again, this whole point we make, exercise selection doesn't matter that much. Coaches have told people, oh, we have to have this exact form, we have to have this exercise to work this area. Oh, this is the secret. Yet 37 other guys don't do that movement, do something completely different, and they're just as jacked. Okay? Why? Because as workloads and intensity go up, everything eventually gets worked unless it is just being painfully neglected. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I'll talk to you guys and gals next time.